Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see everyone here. It's always a delight to be at the UC Student and Policy Center. I was here last week for an event with the UCLA economic forecast. We were facing that direction, so it's a little different to be this way, but we don't have the polls in the way, so look forward to being able to see all of you during the conversation. As you know, today is an important conversation around thinking about wildfires as not just a climate challenge, but a fiscal and economic challenge, and thinking about how to get ahead of that risk. Obviously appropriate on the first heat advisory for Northern California to be talking about this. It sort of feels like we're never not in wildfire season, but we are heading into it now. And it's, as we all know, an enormous challenge for the state. Not only is it an enormous climate challenge for the scale of the wildfires we've had, it's obviously a human and direct economic challenges to those who are affected, and it feels like every year it's getting bigger and more pervasive across the state. And so what we wanted to do, and this we is California Forward convening this conversation, we'll introduce Nuantara in a moment, to help facilitate a conversation around thinking about this issue and recognizing the importance of as a climate and human issue and a public safety issue, but also to think about the economic and risk impacts, not obviously to those directly affected in the homes and structures and families affected, businesses affected by the fires directly, but in the regions around them. I'm sure you've all seen that LA tourism is already down. Some of that because of other external events, but part of it because people don't understand, if they're not here, that LA is a big area, and the fact that Pacific Palisades and Altadena had challenges doesn't mean that the rest of LA is still open for business, so we need to counteract that. And then it has enormous fiscal impacts on the state budget, more generally across the state, and then effects, as we all know, on the homeowners insurance market, which affects those not only in the direct geographies, but all across the state. So we wanted to help convene that conversation. It's great to be in this location where Catherine Baker oversees this. She's also the co-chair of California Forward, and wanted to have this conversation and look forward to the day, a couple of panels, and then a keynote speakers. And with that, let me turn it over to the Director of Programs for California Forward, Nuantara Key.
Thank you. Thank you, Lenny, so much for that. And thank you all for being here. Really appreciate everybody taking the time for this important conversation. As mentioned, I'm Executive Director of Programs at California Forward. And before we get started with kind of diving in on the conversation, I just wanted to give a little bit of context on who California Forward is and why we are convening this conversation here today. So for those of you who may not know, California Forward is a statewide nonprofit really working at the intersection of economic development and opportunity, and really focused on how do we build a new California economy that is sustainable, resilient, and inclusive. And over the years, California Forward has been around for 18 years now. Over the years, we've used different terms to get at those, three components, whether that was triple bottom line or the 3 E's. But really at the heart of it is really recognizing that for California to achieve our goals, we really need to drive an economic agenda that builds on an inclusive, sustainable, and resilient economy. And that recognizing that that requires every region across the state to prosper is part of that. I want to just take a minute to put in context where this conversation falls in for our priorities as California Forward. So our strategic priorities are grounded in kind of these 2 pillars that you see here on the screen. One is recognizing kind of our regions up approach. California Forward has always been an advocate and voice for a regional approach to economic development, economic opportunity across the state, recognizing that some of California's regions are the same size or larger than some states in the country, and that really to achieve economic prosperity requires kind of a regional approach and regional bottoms-up approach here. So we are doing a lot of work to really work on building capacity, but also carrying that regional voice to kind of state policy conversations like those that we're holding today. The other is recognizing that in order to build that new California economy, we have to be incorporating climate. And that is both the energy transition and working towards kind of broad systems change, both in terms of working towards a decarbonized energy system, but also anchoring those investments in regions to deliver economic opportunity and outcomes across regions. And then finally, but very important for today's conversation, a focus around fiscal resilience and really recognizing, as Lenny said, wildfires, but all climate risks need to be managed as a fiscal and economic issue, as well as a public health, public safety, quality of life as issue. And that's where we are really focused on through our fiscal resilience in a changing climate work. So I just wanted to kind of orient you to kind of where this conversation that we're having here today fits within the work that we do as an organization. I'm going to skip over these. Here, a few things that I just want to frame out to before we get started on the panels that I think are important from our perspective at California Forward for this conversation. This conversation is not about the wildfires in LA, but it is in context of the devastating impact that we saw happen in Southern California, but also across the state over the last number of years, going back, from the Rim Fire in 2013, but also recognizing that every region of the state has been impacted by wildfires, whether that's Coffee Park or Paradise, the Woolsey fires in Southern California, and then we were talking about actually with some of the panelists earlier, recognizing that every single region has also been impacted by smoke, and just those recognizing the cascading impact that wildfires are having across the entire state. So we are holding this conversation in context of the increasing severity and intensity of wildfires that are impacting every corner of the state. But we are also holding this in context of, as I've mentioned already, the real need to understand climate risk and wildfire from a fiscal and an economic perspective, which is really important as we're thinking about the policy and fiscal solutions that need to be brought to the table to help us better understand how to manage those impacts. The other piece that I want to frame out here before we get started also is today's conversation, in addition to the fiscal and economic pieces, is very much focused around the built environment. And as you'll hear through the conversation today, there is a continuum between managing our natural systems and the natural landscapes and the built environment. And we need to make sure that we are keeping, as we're thinking about wildfire resilience and the investments and policy solutions, we are keeping that broad continuum in mind, even though today's conversation is around the built environment. So I just want to orient folks that we aren't saying we need to not pay attention to the landscape scale, broader ecosystem resilience, forest management side of things, and we have to keep the momentum there. We also need to be thinking about, as somebody recently said, and you might hear later, the built environment is having its moment right now, post LA wildfire, in the wildfire resilience context. We want to leverage that opportunity, but not lose momentum in other places where we have been making gains and ground. So just want to put that in context as well. So with that, I am going to invite the first panel up here to kick us off. This panel is really focused, again, because of the importance of grounding this conversation and understanding climate as an economic and fiscal risk as much as a public health and safety risk, is really going to focus on why we need to think about managing wildfire as a fiscal risk. So I'm going to invite, yes, our panelists to come on up here. No, please. To come up here. And, I think one thing that I am going to just take a couple minutes here to frame out, so now I'm going to sit down because I'm actually part of the panel, is kind of one thing that really keeps me up at night. And we're going to talk about a number of different things across from kind of how we need to be thinking about sustained revenues for resilience, the role of local financing and economic development structures, and of how we think about managing climate as a fiscal risk. The one thing that, just to kick us off here, that keeps me up at night in this context is that as we are thinking about the role of investing in resilience and the role of managing kind of climate as a financial risk, that we not inadvertently, especially in the near term, make decisions that are not actually reducing the risk, underlying risk, but actually just transferring that risk over to the public balance sheet, because that is a place that I worry that if we're not keeping that goal squarely in mind of the ultimate goal of reducing risk, we cannot manage the fiscal and economic impacts. So that's something that was really a driver in thinking about how to structure this panel and who all to bring on here, is to help us think through what are the solutions that we have in place that don't just transfer the risk to the public, but actually help us drive investment towards reducing risk. So with that, I'm going to hand it over. Actually, Shalini is going to kick us off, and if you would mind, just give an introduction, your personal introduction, and then kind of frame out, and then Michael will go to you, and then Matt, over to you.
This microphone working? Oh, it is now. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Shalini Vachala, and I'm the executive director of a national nonprofit called Pre-Collective. And we work on all things resilient infrastructure. And we work in that early, messy space with communities, with local government, with state agencies, to do what you have to do to build what you need next, instead of just putting Band-Aids on what you have. And so the three main building blocks of how we work are really focused on vision, capacity, and money. And I am an architect by training and a former federal official from EPA, and oftentimes in my work, things are easiest to recognize in their absence. So when you have vision, capacity, and money, everything goes smoothly. We all know what it's like when you have a vision and no money. What we tend to find in our work in pre-development is a lot of times these other ingredients, everybody is focused on the money for doing something, but they're generally missing one of these other two building blocks of knowing what to do and then having enough warm bodies with the right skills in the right places at the right times to actually do those things. And so that's what our team at Pre-Collective does, is we organize around pre-development to make sure you can deliver transformational resilience solutions with and for communities. So what does that look like? It means that in our work, most of the time, success is something that doesn't happen. So in my former life at EPA, this was always applauded in the first year. Storm hit, community wasn't flooded. Second year, your budget went away, because clearly you didn't need it because nothing happened. And the third year, your staff went away. And so I very quickly became someone who learned how to spend other federal agencies' money very well inside of EPA. But also to understand that when you are designing for resilience, you have to think about the money up front, because your outcomes are avoided losses in a lot of cases, and that becomes your new baseline and your status quo. So over the last decade or so, since I stepped down from federal government and got railroaded into continuing what I was doing in public service from a different perch, I've been working on a variety of resilience projects across the country. And one of the things that we've learned over this decade in this context is that very often there's a blurry line between physical risk reduction and financial risk reduction. So I don't know if that was an important thing that just popped up there. Okay. So when you think about physical and financial risk reduction, one of the metaphors that we use really often in our work is I want you to think about this like life insurance and health insurance. You would never trade your health insurance for life insurance, right? Check, okay. Life insurance is great. It's peace of mind. You have to die to get the money. So it's not going to be your first line. That is a financial risk reduction. The physical risk reduction is health insurance. It's the stuff that makes you healthier and safer on a day-to-day basis if you do it right. What it looks like to invest in resilience is the equivalent of saying, I quit smoking, my life insurance rates go down. We have to have enough information about the action affecting the financial risk. Now I want you to imagine, we work with a lot of local governments that are like, but I did a resilience plan. And it's like, yes, but has that reshaped your risk? No. Okay, I built some protections. I did some wildfire risk mitigation. That is the equivalent of going to your health insurance company if each of us picked up the phone today and said, I joined a gym. Do you think they would reduce your rates? No. We have to be able to think about these things at a system scale and at a high enough level of impact to be able to connect our investments in physical risk reduction and financial risk reduction. And that's why I'm really excited about this conversation. How's that for a start?
That's perfect. Oh, perfect. Thank you so much. So, Michael, over to you next to kind of frame out how do you see the intersection of climate risk, insurance markets, and public budgets impacting California's fiscal stability? And really thinking about, I know you're going to talk a little bit about kind of the FAIR plan, but like putting in context why and how we need to be thinking about where we're at on wildfire risk from a fiscal and economic perspective.
I'll just talk loud because I teach. Oh, this will work. Yeah, there we go. Oh, sorry. It's our fault. I probably didn't know. So I started worrying about wildfire. I'll make this a little bit personal. Like in 2017, probably when a lot of us did. I certainly, I think you mentioned the rim fire. Yeah, I was very focused on the rim fire when it was burning because I love that place. And the rim fire for me was about, are we going to lose a place that's deeply, of deep personal meaning to me? But when 2017 occurred, that was different and started thinking a lot about utility costs associated with wildfire. And we tried to do some things in 17 and 18 and 19 as a state to control those costs. But I think in many ways we didn't do the hard thing. The easy thing back then was to ask or tell the utilities to spend a lot of ratepayer money. Because if we're all honest and we're among friends, we might even say that, rates are kind of like taxation without representation. I mean, there is representation at the PUC, but it's not the same as political representation and the feedback loop that occurs there for spending. And we've spent a lot of money in utilities trying to avoid ignitions. It's much better than it was, but we still have utility ignitions. We have at least one for sure in the LA fires, the Hearst fire, and one probably the Eaton fire that caused, enormous loss. So I think we're at a second hinge point in this conversation for California, where electricity rates are sky high. That is like before these fires was the number one issue with all the people I talked to in the legislature was how do we keep electricity affordable? Now we're, increasing, growing. How do we keep insurance available? That's the sustainable insurance strategy. It's all about insurance availability. As I'm going to talk about briefly, it's the way we make insurance available is by pricing it right, which means we create an insurance affordability crisis. Next slide, please. So one thing just to talk, and Nuantara said we're going to focus today on structures and kind of community risk. I think it's really important to make this distinction. When we talk about these large urban conflagration fires, I am a huge advocate for beneficial fire, putting fire on the ground. My team has done a lot of work over the years to try to make that easier for especially prescribed burn associations and tribes in California. And we continue that work. But what happened in LA, you look at this picture, this is one of the satellite images of Altadena burning on January 7th. There's not a lot of hill on fire in that image. The IR is all, the kilowatts are all coming off structures and maybe gardens. And this is a different problem. It's a related problem, and there are blurring around the lines, like the Camp Fire had to do a 10-mile run across, arguably poorly managed commercial forests to get to Paradise in a morning. And then it turned into an urban fire within Paradise. So this is a mixed problem, and it's contextual. But I think it's important to be clear about what problem we're solving for when we're working on this. One set of problems involves beneficial fire, And that is a much more important problem in the mixed conifer forests of the Sierra Nevada. Another problem involves urban conflagration, much more important in places like LA, Santa Rosa, where I live in Marin County. We haven't yet had our urban conflagration fire. I hope we never do, but it's certainly a possibility. And so it's important to be clear about what you're solving for. And I think the economic crisis that the state faces really comes out of these urban conflagrations. Like the level of structure loss that we're experiencing is really problematic. Next slide, please. I said there are other kinds of problems, and this is one I care a lot about too, is I don't want my kids to experience the Sierra brush field. I want them, this is a picture after the Castle fire of one of the dead sequoia groves that was killed in the Castle fire. I want my kids to go to the Sierra and recreate in the forest, just like I did, just like my parents did. That's a different problem though, and I think it's important to understand where they are separate and where they overlap and are supportive, solutions are supportive of each other. Next slide, please. So the urban problem, people are talking a lot about the FAIR plan and insurance rates, but I think it's really important to focus on what's happening in the admitted lines market. That's the normal insurance. This is data we reconstructed from rate filings that just shows what's going on by risk quintile in California. So the red line is the high risk. The orange line is the slightly lower. Q4 is the second quintile of risk. And you can see that if you live in urbanized parts of California, your policy's gone up over the past while, but it's nothing like what is being experienced in the high-risk areas. And this is just the beginning. And that's the thing to understand, right, is this is the before times, before the sustainable insurance strategy is implemented. Once it is implemented, if it is implemented successfully, we can expect this curve to go up more. Even if we don't implement it, because of the losses in Los Angeles and the way that insurance rates are set, the loss experience in LA is going to translate into much higher premiums on its own. Next slide, please. So the other problematic dynamic that California is experiencing is what's going on with people who just can't get access to those admitted lines policies because of price suppression. And we see that here. This is just 2020 and 2024 maps by zip code of FAIR plan concentration. And you can see, I sort of look at these slides and I'm like, it's like when you have bacteria in a petri dish and it's just kind of like growing in the gel, right? Maybe that's like my nerd science perspective on things. Moldy bread and that happens in our house too. So anyway, things are getting worse. Hopefully, and this is a sign of an availability problem, right? That the economics of insurance are such that the regular businesses cannot collect enough money in premiums to pay the claims that they think they're going to have to pay out. And so as a result, we have this system where we sell policies of last resort to an increasing number of Californians concentrated in high-risk areas. So it's like selling health insurance to people that have already been diagnosed with a severe chronic illness. And the difference, though, is that the FAIR plan policies we sell today are radically underpriced. A big tell of that is that after LA, the FAIR plan had to go right away for $1 billion to a $1 billion bailout from the rest of the insurance industry. And they're going into this season, this fire season, radically undercapitalized. So we are not in in theory, the FAIR plan cannot go insolvent because of the way that California law is written, but it is going to need repeated bailouts if we maintain the current approach. And this all creates, this situation with insurance, I think is fundamentally a huge macroeconomic risk for California. And the reason is that insurance is essential for mortgage credit. My family goes pretty far back in the scheme of things for California for like a settler white person. Both my great-grandmothers lived in San Francisco in 1906 in the Mission, and both of their families' homes burned down. I think the moment we're in right now is really similar to 1906 in the sense that after that fire following quake, which occurred 2 years after the Baltimore fire, where 1,700 buildings burned down in Baltimore, in downtown Baltimore, on a cold, windy winter morning. Sound familiar? The insurance industry said, enough. we are not going to insure these buildings. And then the banks said, enough. Then we're not going to provide mortgage credit to build dense urban environments. And the response was a collective effort over a couple of decades to fundamentally alter what those environments look like so they cannot burn in the same way. And we don't have urban firestorms anymore as a result. We are at the very beginning of that change, but that change is essential if we're going to have suburbs. And, you know, people want to live in suburbs, like it or not. You know, not everybody wants to live in downtown Sacramento or downtown San Francisco, like, and the built environment we have in California, it's suburban. Like, we're not going to undo that. So I am both optimistic from that story, right? We did the change. We made the changes, not just in San Francisco, but also in other places to make downtown urban environments safe. And that involved a whole host of things. And that allowed for the economic development we experienced in the 20th century. In the urbanization that occurred in the 20th century could not have happened without those changes. We're at a similar moment for housing I think in California, but also more broadly in the West. And we have to get to work. Because if we don't, the fundamental underpinnings, the fundamental finance that is necessary, a precondition for the existence of the enormous wealth that's created by California real estate, is under threat. So I guess when things can't go on, that's an interesting place to work because they won't and things have to change. And I'm excited to be a part of that and contribute to that change.
Thank you so much. So Matt, over to you next. Great. Sounds like your microphone's
It does sound
great.
yes.
Yes. So if you would, introduce yourself and then kind of frame out from your view that same question around kind of how do you see the intersection of climate risk, whether it's insurance markets or other kind of financial, economic incentives, and the impact also to public budgets and kind of
Yeah,
thinking about our
absolutely.
fiscal stability.
No, thanks, New and Tara. Thanks for having me. Really great to be here. I'm Matt Horton. I'm, as you can see, VP of Policy and Research at LAEDC. And from an economic development perspective, I think there's a lot of implications here, especially on kind of where this breaks down at a local implementation level. So before the fires, well, let me just say, from an EDC standpoint, like our main mission is to do three things simultaneously. How do we attract, how do we retain, and then how do we grow an economy? And so before the fires, we were thinking about this kind of meta challenge. And I was looking at pieces of legislation from the last cycle that Phil Ting passed. I think it was 2488, and the way that he was able to get the synergy between the county and the city up in San Francisco to redeploy tax increment to do some catalytic public risk capital pre-development style work to bolster economic growth. And I said, well, that's really interesting because from a local economic development perspective, there's only so many levers that we can pull in terms of how do we design or inform state incentives to encourage growth, or then how do we deploy or incentivize from a ground up standpoint certain activities that we want to see. On January 7th, I live in South Pasadena, which is just south of Pasadena and Altadena. My dad grew up and his family grew up in Altadena. Luckily, none of their historical homes burned. But it was cataclysmic, and I immediately realized that in order to do economic development moving forward, we had to think about that in tandem with climate resiliency. We can't do these things separately anymore, and we can't live under the illusion that these two things exist in ways that we can do economic development and not do climate resiliency. So, having worked at the Southern California Association of Governments when I was out of grad school, and coming up through that process during the AB 32, SB 375 kind of phase. It's kind of long been the conversation point that our economic development doesn't meet up with our regional planning apparatus. It doesn't. They don't support each other, and they don't even talk to each other because I think that there's a big gap in terms of how do we deploy and leverage capital market solutions. And I think one way to get to what Shalani was outlining is that looking at mechanisms like SB 375 don't produce a project pipeline. We don't get to a point where we can even think about where we deploy capital market solutions because what we've done is separate from an intent to build or an implementation strategy. That's very different than when we look at what our transportation authorities do through their transportation improvement programs. It's very color of money oriented. It's very specific on how the money will flow. Even in that kind of owner-operator model, there's an intent to build there that is kind of separate from how we support that breakdown of regional planning to implementation. So if we're going to think about like solving for that from a systemic standpoint, again, to Shalani, how do we solve these downstream risk uncertainties with upstream investments and incentives? I think we can't shy away from this idea of aligning incentives, in terms of project streamlining, which we see always emerge after these types of catastrophes of let's just throw CEQA out, or let's make it easier to permit or streamline this at the local level. I think we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, how are we not doing that for the priorities that we want to see built upstream? Like, how do we just say, that's just the regime, that's just our new standard process, especially, and not, we don't want to kill animals or endanger future species, but we also need an economy in this state that makes it easier for people to live and flourish. So how do we balance that, I think, is a bit on, whoa, I sound like a computer. I think that also puts us in a kind of reflective standpoint. We need not just local control. We need local control over, or local recognition better over municipal finance. I think there is almost a fiduciary responsibility to understand where we have public assets, how we can leverage those public assets to encourage development, how we can build local capital stacks that support what we want to see built, that kind of do that triple bottom line effect of providing resiliency, providing livability and economic dynamism, and leverage our regional strength. So I think there's ways to do this. I think redevelopment provides a model. The Community Resilience District provides a model. I think, to Michael, to your point, much of the state woke up, or if they didn't wake up after Paradise or Santa Rosa, realizing that most of us are in that urban wildlife interface. And what that means, I think, from a climate resiliency district, as Sasha and I were talking earlier, today there's an uncontiguous model that we can apply to climate resilience district. We could throw projects into that qualification in terms of tiers of where we all live in this climate resilient district exposed to risk. Like, do we need hardening solutions in tier 1 along with water catchment and microgrids for energy certainty, and on down into tier 2? What do those kind of tier 2 communities need in order to be more resilient? And do those resilient investments then reinforce insurability? So there's a process and systemic solution here that's like begging for like a more nuanced conversation across the street.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. Shalini, I'd like to go to you for this next question, which is kind of going back to the point that I mentioned earlier of kind of as we're thinking about how to build towards a framework, as Matt was saying, and from my view, that framework needs to really be mindful that we are actually organizing both our investments, but also just our economic incentives in a way that is driving towards risk reduction, not just transferring over to public balance sheets. I'm curious, your view. You've talked a bit about, in our prep for this, talking about the distinction of kind of insurer of first resort versus insurer of last resort. I'm wondering if you could kind of share your perspective on that, and kind of building on Matt's point of kind of the need for a broader framework of how we need to be thinking about this.
Yeah, and I think this is an incredibly subtle distinction, and it's often difficult to recognize that you've crossed a line until you look back and realize you've crossed a line. So when we think about the role of government, we need governments, federal and state, to be insurers of last resort. You do not want the bottom to fall out from underneath people's lives. You also don't want to be in a position where you are stepping in before that last resort and foreclosing options for others to be able to provide that benefit or the service. That line is squishy. And it is a squishy line in two dimensions. It's squishy because it's hard to know, exactly who needs the help and exactly when. And it's also difficult because insurance is an annual renewal timeframe. And a lot of the times, risk reduction is a decadal set of investments. So this time frame mismatch is something that is incredibly important to solve for at the legislative level. And recognizing that, going back to that life insurance and health insurance, right? You're trying to make sure people have health insurance for their whole lives, not life insurance every year, right? Or instead of. So this is, I think Michael said this directly, which is we have to be super clear about what you're trying to solve for. Because if you solve for this line in a way that you tip toward over incentivizing financial risk reduction, the state will very quickly become the insurer of first resort. And it's difficult to walk back from that. Because once folks have begun relying on the FAIR plan, it's much harder to unenroll folks from, a safety net. And so I think this is something to be aware of in how we craft our solutions. When I think about what it takes to figure out who actually needs the support, who has no options, something we do in our work from the ground up, from resilience planning on risk reduction, is we ask two questions, and we ask them pairwise, always. And it's who loses money if something bad happens, and who suffers. I'm going to repeat them because this is incredibly important and it sounds deceptively simple. Who loses money and who suffers? Oftentimes, the financial risk reduction side of this is tilted toward the people who have high asset values. Those are the people losing money. They are not the people losing their lives. They are not the people losing generational wealth and their homes, and they're not the people who won't be able to come back without assistance. Recognizing that, I think, and paying attention to the gap between those two questions is really a policy design tool. And it's one that I hope can help inform how governments can better decide where they are in that last resort position so that they are there for the folks who are suffering and not overextending for the financial losses.
Point about insurers of last resort.
Please. Yeah, please.
I just think that well, I have a microphone.
Oh, you have your
Am I
mic.
doing- I think that point you made about how do we about being the insurer of last result is so profound, because as the insurance industry starts to see more uptake on the FAIR plan, they're happy to kick that, be like, fine, if the state's going to step in. I just thought that was we had to underline that. I think it's a very good point.
Yeah. Well, I actually would like to turn to you next to kind of think about this, building on kind of this point of how are we moving kind of upstream to reduce risk, and ideally going to this place of kind of the public as insurer of last resort, not first resort. I'm curious, Michael, your view and kind of thinking about, are there lessons learned from other issue areas where we've had to navigate some of these complexities? And at the moment, I know we are all focused on affordability issues in the state, but how, if we want to move kind of to this position of kind of insurer of last resort, how do you balance who pays where across the kind of value chain and thinking about price and affordability issues? And I'm wondering, just from your view, kind of, are there lessons learned on the wildfire space that we could take from the energy side of things, for example, or other examples?
Well, so one thing I think there's a lot we can learn from other states that have gone through insurance crises. One example that I look to that kind of connects with some of what was just said is what Hawaii did after Hurricane Iniki, where folks may or may not remember this hurricane that basically leveled Poipu, the south shore of Kauai, and insurers pulled out. They just withdrew, and until the state stepped in with a state-backed reinsurance that allowed the insurers to feel a little bit more comfortable writing. But the policy design was such that the state was constantly testing whether they could withdraw and whether private reinsurance could step in. And eventually they did withdraw. And so the whole design was temporary in conception. And that's in contrast to sort of what southeastern states have done, where they've permanently entered the insurance markets in ways that have made it very hard to withdraw. And now they're kind of stuck there, subsidizing risk on public balance sheets. I think there are also, there are some fundamental questions in this situation about how we socialize risk and cost. And there is a real, the law governing insurance regulation is superficially, or not even, it's quite similar to how we regulate electric utilities. However, there's a key difference. Everybody pays the same cost per kilowatt hour. We have a social contract in California that even if you live out at the end of a distribution line that's running through a bunch of super high risk country, the utility has an obligation to provide electric service, and they can only charge you the same cost they charge someone that lives in downtown Sacramento. And that's cross subsidies. And we have decided as a state that is a cross subsidy we are going to provide. It has a growing cost, as we have seen. But it's worth it, right? We want to allow people to live anywhere and not make electricity so expensive that they can't live there. How far we go down that road in the insurance space is an interesting question, right? Today, other states effectively subsidize California insurance costs because reinsurance for large national carriers is handled at the national level. So as we have more disasters, the total reinsurance cost for State Farm goes up, and that means that someplace with no wildfire risk is subsidizing California policies a little bit. There's an internal to California question about that map. How what's called segmentation occurs. How much we are going to ask urban dwellers in California to support insurance prices in the more high-risk rural or suburban parts of California. That's a question, right? That's a social decision. It's not purely a risk-based business decision. And that's something we can think about and talk about as, that's a values choice. And we're making a particular decision right now, but it's not the only one by any means. And it could change. I guess where I come back to with all of this is to think that the work that Shalini and Matt are doing is fundamental. That there's no way to financially engineer our way out of this problem. The work on the ground has to happen in terms of physical risk reduction so that there is less risk and therefore less risk to pay to transfer, which is what insurance does to someone else. That is the only way out. It's especially the only way out if you consider the impacts of climate change, because this problem is getting worse faster than other climate impacts for a very simple scientific reason, which is that the dryness of the atmosphere is a square of the temperature change. So as temperature changes a little bit, the air gets a lot thirstier, and that drives fire risk. And that's what we're observing, not just here. Canada is the place that's burning this afternoon, right? Go look on any IR satellite map, and you can see Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and today it's BC and Alberta are just like lit up. And that's just a fact. And given the rates of change, right, given that this public infrastructure we're talking about, whether it's electric infrastructure or streets or public policies that change social behavior at a scale that's big enough to alter risk, takes a long time to achieve. We need to be planning for what that situation is going to be in a decade or 20 years, and not even as horrible as it was on January 7th.
Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, and I think there's really tactical ways that we can do this on the ground from a local economic development standpoint. So the profound need to accelerate and build more housing around the state kind of underscores kind of a wraparound solution here. And one in two ways where I see some challenges. So in communities like Santa Clarita, California, when the master developer comes in and says, I want to put in a community here, and the county says, well, we can't provide services there, everybody knows like Melrose kicks in, and homeowners have to pay more on top of HOAs in order to do really basic things. I see a reality where that dynamic gets applied to insurability, where if you want fire hardening solutions, if you want undergrounding, or if you want, the homeowners are gonna have to kick in more money, which is scary in a state where housing attainment is already so hard. So I think ways that we can combat that are kind of going back to some of those asset-based economic development imperatives that I kind of spoke about earlier. So taking a look at insurability, we have, for earthquakes, we have like brace and bolt. But for like a housing corollary to that could be eaves and overhangs. And so how do we do that from a manufactured housing standpoint? We saw some of those benefits in Palisades and in other parts of the state where housing with pre-engineered eaves and sustainable building materials don't burn or burn less. So what can we do there in terms of jump-starting a whole new economic dynamic around sustainable building materials? We can leverage our ports from an import-export standpoint, create and open up new markets around bamboo production, create new opportunities that signal to the insurance community that, hey, we've got a whole economy, reciprocal economy dynamic here that revolves around sustainable building materials that probably ups our insurability score. So I think these are some of the kind of lessons that we need to learn and apply to how we think about, responding to rising costs, but providing more economic opportunity around resilient and sustainable futures.
Thank you, Matt, and I appreciate your use of insurability because as somebody who has worked in the insurance world for a bit, I have seen, especially in the resilience and adaptation space, a lot of focus on insurance and insurance products as the solution. And I think we are moving to a place where we're moving beyond that and understanding, to your point there that you mentioned earlier, too, of, we really need to be focused on reducing the physical risks in communities. And we can't, have just a fiscal solution. And I think the conversations on insurance are moving in the right direction around that point, which is we ultimately need to be talking about insurability. Are we reducing the underlying risk so that insurance availability is, meeting, and we have kind of a sustainable not affordability, yes, but availability point. And the only way we get there is through risk reduction. So one question I have, or do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, it's just listening to Matt, your comments, and new interiors is, I think we're at a moment, particularly with reinsurers, where it sort of reminds me of when the euro was threatened. There was a run on the euro back in about 2011 or 2012. Spain was falling apart. Greece was in default. And Mario Draghi got up, who was the central banker for the euro, and said, we will do whatever it takes. Like, there was a very clear market signal that was made. And the markets chilled out. And the euro is survived as a currency. I think we're at a moment in California wildfire where the reinsurers really need that signal. They asked for it 5 years ago, and they didn't really get it. Like, we spent a lot of money on utilities. There are a lot of things that we have done to ramp up our support for especially better forest management in California and community level stuff. But the insurers, they kind of don't care about that, in all honesty. They care about houses and structures. And there is a kind of need, I think, to make a sustained commitment to do what it takes in California, or we really are going to have an insurability issue that's very hard to treat, particularly for these catastrophic outcomes. 100%.
Great. Well, one quick follow-on, and then I'll go to my other question, which is, what does that look like? What does that signal to reinsurers look like from your view?
I think it means that the Board of Forestry approves a regulation that is tough but fair on Zone 0, and then we have a sustained effort to actually implement safety. Like, this is gardening and like vents, covered vents, and covered gutters. It is not everything. It's what, if Frank Freevelt or Dave Winokur were here, the mitigations that matter. And a sustained effort, institutional effort on the part of the state to help the local governments do that work. And it has to be done at the local level. It has to be done with people that are trusted in the community, that are embedded in communities. It can't be like people parachuting in to say, you need to do this. It's an act of persuasion backed up with some enforcement, but the persuasion has to come first, and we need that effort. That is the thing that the insurers are asking for, wanting to see. And I'm hopeful that we'll get there. I think this could be a pivotal moment where we actually can achieve something like that, or the beginnings of something like that. But it's going to take some intention, and then making the clear statement. We are doing this because we are going to do what it takes.
Thank you. Yeah, you add to that, and then we have one more question, because then we're going to open it up for audience Q&A as well.
Okay,
But
perfect.
yeah, each of you.
I think this might be my former EPA hat on, but I often found myself, people would ask, does this require a carrot or a stick? And I would say that I've spent the last 2 years hitting people with carrots. Like, I think we have a little bit of a false sense of incentive uptake. And so I would really strongly agree with this point of we will do whatever it takes. But I do think California in some ways doesn't have control of the levers of the systems as directly as Draghi did in the EU case. So I think we need, in that whatever it takes, to have a nesting doll of things that build confidence over time. And that is systems levers, regional efforts, and local signs of progress. We have to be able to stack these stories and build up the anecdata that we need for market confidence to sustain itself. And so I think it is more complex. And I will say the bookend of the hitting people with carrots is I had a quote taped to my door at EPA when I was there. And it said, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. And I would work best with the people who could laugh about that. And so I think all of you being able to understand that and carry it into, really embed the theory, but test with practice. Otherwise, this stuff could languish for years.
Matt, can I ask you to touch on one
But
thing?
I can't hold it in.
I know, as you're going. But one thing we haven't really talked about yet, but I just want to interject into this, is the need for sustained revenue. To your point of, we can't, fiscally engineer our way out of this, but I also don't see a path forward to get to the risk reduction, to get to the framework pieces, if we don't have sustained revenue for the investment in risk reduction. So please weigh in, but if you can, just what are your thoughts around sustained revenue?
Well, I think that's such a good point, and I can see kind of the reciprocal nature of that. So if, in the context of the last coordinated economic development strategy that this state had, which was redevelopment, and how we used to incubate public risk capital for public benefit, especially from an affordable housing development standpoint, I think we've seen really steep decline since post 2000. Was it 12 when RDAs were disillusioned? And anyway, I think the goal here is to say, if even now, we're going to do a climate resilient district, and people think that might be the solution. How are we going to pin increased property taxes to places that may be uninsurable? So we've got to think about that of how are we pinning public risk capital to public benefits in ways that reinforce the insurability of these. That's either through building codes, like what Berkeley is doing right now with their brush clearing ordinance. I think we have to think about the breakdowns, as I said earlier, of mechanisms or programs like sustainable community strategies that are a part of the SB 375 legislation. We have to actually build sustainable communities, not just plan for them. So, and what that means, from obligating tax increment finance, for an example, through the CRD or the Climate Resilience District, to certain projects that the insurance market and other types of public-private partners can come in and say, yes, if the state has skin in the game in these areas, then these communities are more insurable. They are more valuable. So it becomes reciprocal in that sense.
Please, yeah.
This is a problem that my team and I have been just hammering away at for the better part of a decade in terms of sustained revenues. And I think there's a piece to this where we aren't doing a great job of looking at the cascading losses that are showing up on multiple levels of balance sheets. And so we're talking about this as a more money, more like do more and do better, right? But there's a flip side to this, which is our costs are going up. And so we have to actually be able to tell this story in a way where we can say, oh, we're avoiding these revenue losses. And this is something California is super skilled at. We have made like the case for energy efficiency and solar so brilliantly over the last few decades that people think about this as, oh, this is my path to cost savings. We need to be able to do this at the scale of like capital planning. And I think 3 areas where this shows up on local and state balance sheets are, we are seeing revenue losses due to fire. Yep. Property, income, it's just, you can track this. It's not rocket science. We don't need false precision around this either. We don't need insurance models to do this. You need like the right number of zeros. Are we at 100 million or are we in billions? The second thing is our assets are lasting less long. Talk to any utility that's spending billions of dollars. We are seeing roads, power lines, things that are underpinning infrastructure being degraded and disrupted and lasting decades less long than we had planned for. So the fiscal impact there. And the last thing is I think we are really in a position where we've now experienced a lot of cascading failures across state and local balance sheets. And if you ask people to say, can you afford that next year? Did that cost more this year than last year? You can start having these conversations. And Matt, I loved your language around the intent to build, because the biggest challenge we have around risk reduction is getting people to start. That motivated action, because everyone knows they should, but you have to find that driver to say, but I will now. And that's the difference between theory and practice in this space. So I think sustained revenues have to push into that.
Right. Any final reflections or points here before we open it up to the audience?
No, I know we make it we make it sound easy, and I know the sausage making that happens over there is a real challenge. And I think what kind of the elephant in the room here, I think, goes back to third rail, California, Prop 13 issues around, use of funds and the ability to pull levers at what time. So, I think we all, as a local practitioner, I think we all understand that. But I think we have to figure out, to Michael, to your point, we've got to dream a little bit bigger. There's less and less support, obviously, coming from the Confederate government. So what do we do in the absence of that? To support, the California dream. We have tremendous assets, whether it be our R&D potential up and down the state through our universities, our ability to commercialize and derive revenue from those opportunities, to attract global investment. I think we have to start thinking in those terms.
Great, thank you all. So now we have a few minutes here to take questions from the audience. Yes, right up here, Mark. There are microphones coming, so.
Okay, thank you, Taylor. So I press right. Is it on? Oh my God, it is. Okay, thank you. I love everything you guys said. I want to offer a hopefully not delusional scenario for getting to success politically on what it takes to get, one, a major reform of insurance, and two, exactions for sustainable revenue. And that's just for the sake of the audience. I'm in the municipal bond business. I've been doing tax measures and bonds for 40 years now, and I have an idea of what it takes to get in front of a room of people and get them to vote to tax themselves. And the example I go to, you mentioned Hurricane Nikki in Florida. Michael, we also had Hurricane Andrew in 1992. I'm sorry, Nikki was in Hawaii. And what Florida did some amazing things in the mid-1990s to reform insurance, What drove that was their board of realtors statewide had done a complete reversal on their political opposition to doing what needed to be done. Why did they do that? Because the home mortgage market melted down, it imploded, and they couldn't make a living anymore. So the message from Florida on getting huge, deep change is that the mortgage market needs to fail, okay? Now, what happens, and having been through this, I'm sure everyone in the room has had some level of this, is that when a particular market fails, either locally, regionally, or statewide, there's panic, fear, loathing, panic, emergency measures, do whatever it takes, and you don't have a lot of farsightedness going on and a lot of finger pointing going on, which means that you're better off if you have a contingency plan. So now I'm going to wrap this up. What I think is our best vehicle to success is having a contingency plan along the lines you all have been talking about, addressing those issues, ready to go for when the mortgage market in California fails, okay? And so I am betting that the mortgage market sooner or later in our state is going to fail. Right now, what I see is we don't have a contingency plan. So let's, even if we can't implement it now, let's at least develop it. So that's my editorial, and thank you. And again, great insights, guys.
Anybody? Yeah.
It's nice to see you. I think there's a really great example of this that's hot off the presses from North Carolina. And so we did some work about 8 years ago to take catastrophe bonds and tweak them so you would get credit for risk reductions. And the state of North Carolina just issued one of these bonds for $600 million and tied it to their fortified roof program so that if their losses are lower than what the insurance industry models, they will actually get funds revolved back from each of their policies to do more resilience measures. That's the kind of source of sustained revenue where you're turning the system to the benefit of the state, and you're not relying on an absurd amount of modeling and uncertainty going in. You're saying, we'll show ahead of time what it takes. So it took that upfront investment in the risk reduction, but now you have a mechanism for it to become a virtuous cycle. And so I think that's an element of this contingency plan. It's not just don't let the bottom fall out or be ready when the bottom falls out, but it's also flip it to a virtuous cycle.
Appreciate that. Other questions? Oh, yep, here in the front.
Yeah, hi, I'm going to take a different tactic from Mark. My name is Lisa Worthington. I work for Caltrans here in headquarters, known for building something, right? You talk about highways, but also very actively involved in the governor's Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force, proactively really thinking about highways not as only a building highways company, but also a public landowner that could have a structural function building resilience, not necessarily just pavement and roads, but building resilience into the highway system itself. Strategic fuel breaks is really if you think about, well, what does that actually mean? It means that highways can function as a fire break in the WUI. Also enable more, they do.
I saw it firsthand. The 210 freeway was the fire break of the Altadena.
Exactly. So 8 years ago, there was no such thing as the program that I'm now the chief of. I have to credit the governor's Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force for pulling Caltrans into that. Management level decisions in order to be able to think that way. So public lands do have a very important role to play. Maybe that's the regional efforts that you were referring to. I happen to be a landscape architect, so it works really naturally with my background and profession to be thinking about unimproved lands that are linear and publicly owned, functioning in a resilient fashion. So I just want to bring some positive into this challenging question.
Let me, quick editorial on that. I think the state and local jurisdictions are probably sitting on hundreds of millions, if not billions, of uncaptured value in terms of that. So in how we can develop these parcels of lands as and you know, put them into you know, a deal, a public-private partnership deal where we're getting, it's not extractive, but we're getting actual economic value, whether it's housing at station stops or some types of you know, public rest stations along highways. I think we need to figure out, you know, what's our fiduciary responsibility to measure and capture and those assets and you know, really harness those values for public benefit.
I will add to that. So first of all, I'll applaud what you just said, Lisa. I think it's incredibly important. It's exactly this entry point into the intent to act. We're doing work in Illinois on flood exactly associated with railway and roadway right-of-ways. And it's the opposite of how do you retain water, keep it off of roads and railways, and use the supply chain disruption reductions to help finance nature-based solutions. And so I think once you start getting into that, who's losing money and who's suffering, you will find revenue sources to help continuously expand these kinds of efforts. So love it.
Great. Thank you so much. We do need to transition over to our next agenda item, but I just want to thank our panelists here. So thank you so much. Give them a round. And my last parting comment here as we transition to the next speaker is, and building off Shalini, what you said, and then Lisa, your point, I think while we need sustained revenue and we need to figure out how to be driving more sustained investment in risk reduction and resilience, I want us all to keep in mind that, to your point, we are spending money every day, and every one of those investments is an opportunity for us to be thinking about ways we can build resilience into our communities and into our economic systems. So appreciate your final comment and leaving us with a glimmer of hope. So thank you. So now, yes, we're great. It is my honor to welcome Senator Becker, who is joining us here today. I just want to acknowledge and thank Senator Becker for his leadership, both on advancing, clean energy and leveraging technology to provide greater economic mobility over the years, but also, importantly, being a leading voice on really the importance of coordinated kind of implementation strategy around wildfire resilience, and many issues that are near and dear to California Forward's heart and our priorities. Senator Becker has been a real champion of, including through his role as chair of Senate Energy, Utility, and Communications Committee, as well as the Senate Select Committee on Economic Development and Technological Innovation, and also on the Senate Insurance Committee, all of which are issues that we're obviously talking about here today and that California Forward is working on, and really appreciate the opportunity to partner with Senator Becker over the years. So with that, I will hand it over to you, and thank you again so much for being here.
Yeah. All right. I don't know if I should stand or sit. I might start standing and then sit. But I do appreciate it. I do find myself very much in sync with California Forward's policy priorities and philosophy. And that's so much so that I texted Kate. I was like, do you really just want me to talk about wildfires? I mean, there's so much so that we agree with around economic development more broadly. And she said, yeah, focus on wildfire, but some other pieces. So I might touch on a few other areas as well. I just want to thank Les Spahn, my legislative director, who's here in the back, who spent a lot of time, many, many years in the Capitol working on a lot of these issues, especially wildfire issues with Senator Dodd previously. And that was a big focus, obviously, of their office. And Connor, my intern, who's in the back, I really appreciate his support. And I just want to say that was a lot of valuable info on that last panel. Even though I know these people individually, just really hearing everyone was excellent. And I've already feel like I've more than gotten my money's worth, because seeing that picture of Matt with his old haircut was really, that was like worth the price of admission alone. I think we should we could raise money for wildfire mitigation by auctioning off the right to shave Matt's hair or something. We could make a lot of money. So I thought that was great. But listen, a lot of what we just talked about, in that last panel is very much stuff that we're thinking about. As you mentioned, I chair energy. Last 2 years, I chaired the budget subcommittee on resources, so focused a lot on wildfire. So much that I was like, wait, I think there are a lot of different pieces here. I'm going to put together my own wildfire strategy. So there's an 8-point plan that's still on my website, a little bit dated at this point. But there's no one silver bullet, right? But it's all of these pieces, right? It's the forest treatment piece. It's the aerial resource. It's all focused basically around prevention and then early detection and suppression, right? But it's the prescribed burns. It's all these pieces coming together. A lot of that was talked about. I'd say that what I really don't like is when there's areas that we don't know what to do. And from the last panel, there's some uncertainty, but more so, I hear a lot in this space that we do know what we need to do. It's just hard to do it, and that doesn't make it necessarily easier. But for me, those are fun problems to solve because I feel like. Same thing with utility bills and other, which we could also talk about. We kind of know what we need to do. It doesn't mean it's easy politically to do it, and not even just politically, but the whole gestalt of the of moving society in certain directions is not easy. But I feel like if we at least know what to do, that is helpful, and we can make plans to get there. Just to cover it for sure, as you all know. This is a rapidly intensifying climate crisis. It's not just an environmental issue; it's an economic issue, a housing issue, an insurance issue, a human issue. We hear all those stories from my colleagues from Southern California this year, and it is burning through our public budgets, our insurance markets, our sense of safety in the places that we call home. Again, we are making some progress, right? So when I was chair of the budget subcommittee, we got to work on doubling the CAL FIRE budget. We got to work on and pick up Senator Wachowski's efforts. By the way, Senator, I think Wachowski really tried to steer this in the right direction in terms of getting the most bang for the buck in terms of doing the forest treatment that we need to do. We have the largest aerial firefighting force in the country. And I think we need to expand that. I think that's a whole other conversation that we need to have. And there's various ways to do that. People are looking at autonomous drones. I think, was talking to folks about, why are we leasing 2 super scoopers from Canada, right? What if we could build our own factory here and build super scoopers here and lease them for other states? Right? I mean, there's lots more I think we can do around those kind of aerial resources, but that's a big step forward that we did, right? We're about a plane 20 minutes from any wildfire. We're lots of new technologies that we're working on. I look at AFRAC there. I know you're working on some fun technologies. One of the first things I did after getting elected, representing my district with my background, was do a wildfire tech town hall. And I remember we had Pano on there when it was a tiny company, just because I knew the entrepreneur. And then I was in Australia and New Zealand a year or two later talking about wildfires and insurance and all these topics, and there they were on TV in Australia because they're using them there. And so we're seeing that this is really a global issue, but we're seeing new technologies that are arriving and that we need to continue to nurture. We do also have the fact that most of California's forest land is not managed by the state, right? So it's managed by the federal government. Roughly 60% of the forests are under federal jurisdiction. That means the health of our forests and the safety of our community depends on our collaboration with federal partners. And unfortunately, that is being absolutely undermined by the Trump administration. We saw them fire many people in the U.S. Forest Service, hundreds of layoffs, and it was just completely irresponsible and made no sense. And it puts California communities at risk. There's just no getting around that. But these are some of the main people who conduct prescribed burns, clear fuel loads, maintain forest access, and when they're not in place, the risk really skyrockets. We do need that fully staffed, federally funded federal partner because of that reason. And we know that a fire doesn't know red districts and blue districts. This is something across the state. Now, one area that you touched on the last panel that is a vexing question is the insurance market, and I specifically requested a seat on the insurance committee this year because it's a big issue in my district. I hear it all the time now from people who are losing their home insurance. And we could talk for hours just on the topic of insurance, but there are clearly a bunch of global things that we needed to do to try to stabilize the markets even before the LA fires. Fortunately, we have an insurance commissioner who's committed to getting a lot of those things done, and I want to commend him for doing some of the hard work that has had to get done, and putting some of those things in place. Because the fact that after January 7th that we didn't just have every insurance company just immediately leave California was actually a very positive step. The fact that they feel like we are doing the things that some of the things that we need to do to move forward. But that's a big conversation. I had a bill last year that's saying, hey, insurance companies in their underwriting models should take into account the community level work that's being done, right? If Napa decides to harden us and put $17 million as a community, if Hillsborough says, you know what, we're not going to just do one home, we're going to do the whole community, they should take that account in their underwriting models. I got pushed back from that, and that bill did not succeed. I think it started an important conversation, but they really felt like we got to stabilize the market first, and I did get that in some respect, but we do need to keep figuring out ways. How do we align that individual incentive? As I think Shalini said, you said something about with risk reduction, we're going to motivate people to start, right? And right now people feel like, hey, I'm going to do all this work and spend all this money and get no benefit from it. That's not a great value proposition for homeowners. So we have to kind of get to that feeling that we're actually, we could do the work and we're going to get the benefit for it. And I think Michael is one of the leading thought leaders on this in this space. I think you kind of laid it out pretty well, right? They don't necessarily care maybe about that community level mitigation. They really want to see that home level mitigation. And I have a bill, SB 326, that right now is already, I think, an important bill because it's about those bigger strategic plans, but we're really trying to look at ways, working with Michael and others, to have it focused on this zone zero, focused on community support. How can we really put in place that procedure, the carrots and maybe some of the sticks to make sure that we start doing that home level mitigation, which is not going to be easy for people to do. But we've seen that it's absolutely critical. So that, combined with some of the things that Matt mentioned, or, building codes and other things that some cities are doing can be part of that answer. But again, if homeowners feel like, they're going to do all the work and not get the benefit, that's not a good value proposition. We have to change that going forward and make that clear. Let's see. I probably want to maybe leave time for a few questions. I do have to get on the road here. I'll just note that the impacts really are not felt equally. We do know people who are low income and at risk. They oftentimes they're at risk of losing their insurance, as we saw in Altadena, and they're at risk then of losing insurance, of having to sell out rather than waiting to know that. Knowing that if say Southern California Edison is found liable at some point, then even if they have insurance or not, they get paid out, but they can't wait around. We're seeing people swoop in and trying to buy these buildings. So it's this is a situation that it really is tragic at a whole bunch of levels when this plays out. And so if we're going to be serious about this question about resilience and community level resilience, there's a lot of things that we have to do. But it's about investing, again, not just in CAL FIRE, but in local fire districts, in the community, in the fire safe councils, in tribal programs, in community-based efforts, in the California Conservation Camp program, which allows incarcerated individuals to provide a public service in order to meet their debt to society. And we need to demand more coordination from our federal partners and see them with more staffing, more urgency. And then we need to rebuild the insurance market in a way that reflects the modern climate risk and modern community action. And that's what we talked about a little bit in the last panel: data-driven models, transparent practices, insurance products that incentivize mitigation, not retreat. And finally, we need to embed fire resilience into everything we do, from land use planning to energy infrastructure to economic development. This isn't a siloed problem, and it won't be served by siloed solutions. But let me just say this. I do remain hopeful because the path is not easy. But as I started out, I like areas where we feel like we know what we need to do, and then it's just a matter of how do we in the legislature, working with the agencies, steer that in the way that we need to go. So I'm just grateful for you convening this conversation. You're going to see a lot of activity this year. Next week, we'll be taking up the wildfire package. They wanted to make sure in the Senate that every bill in our wildfire package got heard on the floor. So that's why you heard us pulling some bills off of consent to make sure that we actually, everything gets a hearing and people can hear what we are doing specifically with that wildfire package. But we know that there's a lot of other pieces that have to come together this year. So just grateful. Would it be helpful to take a few questions or? Sure. Yeah. Only one good one. Lenny gets a question if he wants, but we go way back. I have a lot of respect for Lenny, so I appreciate seeing you here.
Can you just talk for another minute or two about what you'd really like to see happen in the insurance markets that we might be able to advocate for or support that can help create that incentive for resilience as opposed to running away?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had a simple answer. I think it is complicated. Again, I do think that first we had to do a bunch of the work that the insurance commissioner did at the end of last year. So we had to kind of do some of the work around reinsurance and forward-looking models and that work, and just kind of having his back while he did some of that heavy lifting, was really important. And I think now it's, and probably it's deeper conversation, but look at SB 326, the bill we're looking closely with Michael Wara, and see if you have ideas as we work to craft that bill to really focus on this sort of home level mitigation effort. And then I think where you can be helpful is you may already be doing this, but in convening roundtables with the insurance companies, because I think too much, we are just up here, we're just running around so much. We're running around from committee to committee to bill to bill. We have so much going on. And it really wasn't until I had a bill that the insurance companies really hated that, they kind of came to my office and we sat down and actually had some good conversations. And so I think, hearing from them is important, because as Michael gave that example from the euro, right? Sometimes it's sending the market signal, right? It's like, the people here talking to their bosses, like, okay, do they feel like California is ultimately listening to them and moving in the right direction? Or do they feel like California doesn't give a shit and, we're going to do what the hell we want, So, to be a little flip. But it's really a lot of this, business, as rational as you'd hope it would be, a lot of it kind of comes down to high school and feelings and all that sort of part. And really, honestly, like the insurance companies, they're just sort of, they're really like on the fence, like 1 foot in, 1 foot out of California. So I think convening some of that, making them feel heard, honestly, and making sure that we as legislators have a chance to engage with them in some, I think, interesting ways, which honestly just doesn't really happen for the most part, I think would be very helpful.
Thank you so much for taking the time. Great. We're really excited to invite the next panel up here, and I really appreciated the senator's language and framing around kind of areas where we know what to do, but it's really hard. And I feel like if that doesn't capture what this panel is going to be talking about, I don't know what best would. But please join me in welcoming Jana Valakovic as moderator, and she will take it from here.
Thank you very much. What a fun afternoon. So much rich conversation. My brain is tickled. I'm excited to continue the dialogue and the engagement during this next 40-minute or so panel. The way we're going to structure this here is that we're going to have some quick introductions, and then we're going to go into just a short primer on the background and some context setting, and then we've got 3 rich questions for each of these folks to work through, and then we'll hope to leave enough time for some audience introduction or audience questions and engagement. But if that doesn't all work, at least we'll have the reception afterwards to continue the conversation. So a plug out for that. So my name's Jana Valakovic, and I work for the University of California. It's kind of fun to be sitting next to a backdrop of our organization. And so, here we're talking about the fire-adapted community space and planning for a more fire-resilient future. And so, I just want to talk in this context around the built environment having its moment and to reflect a bit on how we got to that point. So let me introduce the panel and let you guys, give us a couple short opening thoughts here and who you are, and then we'll get into it.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Hossein Mahmoud. I'm a faculty in civil engineering at Colorado State University, soon to transition to Vanderbilt. My group works on sustainable and resilient infrastructure and communities. What we try to do is model damage to the built environment under different types of hazards. So we work on seismic and flood and wildfires and so on. And then we try to understand how different sectors interface during the recovery process. So we develop socio-physical models. And of course, I'm here to talk about the work we're doing on wildfires.
And what Hussam didn't say is that he just got back from Egypt last night. So, so thank you for... So my name is Molly Mowry, and I am the executive director of a nonprofit that I co-founded with my colleague Kelly Johnston. We are called the Community Wildfire Planning Center, and we focus exclusively on the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface, the built environment. My background is as a trained and certified land use planner, so I bring a lot of land use planning solutions to the Wildland Urban Interface, which is also having its moment over the past couple of years. So I'm excited to talk about fire-adapted communities and where that takes us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Mudley-Daniel. I come here from the heart of Trinity County in Hayfork, where I'm the co-executive director of an organization called the Watershed Research and Training Center, which was started about 30 years ago to redevelop our economy in my hometown of Hayfork. And so I come with kind of a rural communities perspective and a long history of doing land stewardship and fire stewardship in place. But I also come as the director of the Fire Adapted Communities Network, where we work with hundreds of community leaders in places very different from Hayfork. So we work with people in LA, we work with people in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey and in Hawaii and in Alaska, all across the country. And from the last decade of working with those leaders, I've learned a lot about what community fire adaptation is and how different that looks in different places. So I'm really excited to be here today to share some of the things that I've learned about what those needs look like across California and some ideas around solutions.
Good afternoon, everyone. Steve Frisch with the Sierra Business Council. We work in a 17-county region in the Sierra Nevada, and we really focus on this intersect of climate adaptation and sustainable economies. So a lot of our work has focused in on natural resource management and wildfire mitigation as both a key risk, but also an opportunity for economic growth and prosperity in our region, which sometimes I think we have to look at the two of them together. Really happy to be here with my fellow rural resident. We've done a lot of work with the Watershed Center over the years. But right now, SBC's kind of wildfire-related work is focusing in on a couple of different aspects of the Forest Management Task Force, including wood utilization and workforce development, looking at the link between wildfire resilience statewide and the workforce that is necessary to implement all of the various strategies. We do a lot of work around bioeconomy development and provide direct technical assistance to about 14 now bioeconomy businesses in the Sierra Nevada region and some of them outside the Sierra Nevada region. And we also have an entrepreneurship program that provides technical assistance to startup and expanding businesses that are essentially focusing on developing business models that will address wildfire resilience work across the region. And we've graduated about 60 people from that program over the last year and a half. Ironically, with federal funding, which we hope is maintained in the future. So, and then finally, I would say we do a lot of work with many of you in the room as well around advocacy for new wildfire resilience policy statewide, including funding advocacy, which we think is a really, really important piece of the picture. You know, money doesn't solve everything, but it sure helps get to unlocking market forces that can actually then amplify the impact. So we think that's super important.
So you can tell it's quite an esteemed panel. Well, to launch us all off here, I just have a couple opening thoughts. And so you can stretch your neck, not your body, but your neck over to the right-hand side here. And I just want to give us a little sense of both hope and optimism and a chance to kind of level set on a number of items. I hail also from the North Coast and from rural communities. My technical training is originally as a forester, and I lived through the Oakland Hills fire in 1991, and it's an interesting space to watch the evolution throughout my career and where we've come to, how long it's taken us to supercharge the policy, and that real lag to what has happened over the last 6 or 7 years. And I just really want to acknowledge and appreciate all of you, because you've all had a hand to play in this, some bigger than others, and it's a real pleasure to have partnered and collaborated with you over the years, and I look forward to more engagement on that front. I do a lot of work now in the post-fire environment, trying to understand how buildings burn and what their inherent issues are, and that's largely because after the Tubbs fire in 2017, my professions came back with, we just need more fuel breaks. That was the solution that the forestry community came up with. And it was like, well, yes. And there's something more nuanced about that. And there's a lot more about the vulnerability of communities to draw from. So, now my work is really now at the statewide scale. I'm a part of the UC Fire Network, and I'm working specifically in the built environment. And then we're also standing up a new policy institute related to a number of different issues, which I'll have a part to play in. So, just to kind of level set this, 1 out of every 7 acres in California has burned in the last decade. That's not all bad fire. A lot of that has done some good work across the state, and a lot of it has some major impact, especially in our forested environments. But when you put that in context, it really gives us a sense of why we've spent so much time, I think, in the policy arena, focusing on the wildland, focusing on prescribed fire, focusing on liability, really trying to get to pace and scale and supercharge that. But at the same time, we've lost 57,000 structures in that time space. And part of the challenge is that, embers are contributing in major ways to that structure loss equation. And I think many of us struggle to try and figure out, well, how do you fight an ember? What does that really mean? How do we get behind these challenging issues with the sense that there's something insidious that can come from anywhere at any time and cause damage? And so one of the things that I just want to bring forward to this conversation, and I can see it in how we've been laying out the dialogue today, is that when it comes to it, I think we've had more luck in framing the issues around it being a forest fire issue. So, here, Smokey the Bear, prevent forest fires, has been the framing that we've thought about this wildfire issue. Yet more homes are burned in grassland and shrub ecosystems than they are in forests. And most of our solutions have been focusing in this forest arena. So we've got to figure out how to level set that in California. That's the national statistics, and the California statistics don't look any different. Hello. Sorry. And so in 2006, we expanded defensible space in California to have a second zone. So it went from 0 to 30 feet to 30 to 100 feet. These are the graphics that the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection put out in their advisory panel around this. And, there's some interesting things. I want to know, does anyone live in an environment that looks like this, besides Chris Anthony? Right, so these images showed it's a forest issue. You live in a log cabin, and if you thin your trees, then there's going to be, some, added benefit about it. This was quite effective in really creating management related to average fire conditions, where we were creating a defendable space, where what the goal was really to try and move the fire from the crowns of the trees to the ground, so that the oncoming flames were something that you could have direct attack on. But what it missed was that ember issue, and what I think we're really struggling with now is how to socialize this issue for the broader public. So, excuse my clip art here, but the framing is that we now have ignitions that occur somewhere else, and they come through connected fuels in the wildland, whether that be forests, whether that be shrubs, whether that be woodlands. And you have that fire transition to the built environment. It finds a lot of fuel. I'm illustrating this now with a fence. And then you can have a direct run at the structure, because you've now connected that fuel from the wildland to the built environment fuels. At the same time, you've got this ember ignition issue, which is causing ignitions and spot fires in front of the firing front. Whether that gets to the urban conflagration or not really depends if you've got wind on it. And if you've got a lot of wind, the transition to a much bigger challenge happens very quickly, and we surround our buildings with kindling and we're hoping for a different outcome. So why I bring this forward is because people don't see themselves in this issue. I spend more time on the ground trying to communicate these fire issues, and people will say, I don't live in a forest. This isn't my problem. This is, we can't create policies and solutions for other people to follow. We have to create policies and solutions for us to follow. And so there's some well-known E's of fire prevention in the fire risk prevention framework, and they involve a number of different strategies, and I think this is really useful for our conversation today. One is a lead on education, right? People can't take action if they don't understand the issue. Secondarily, there's a lead on engineering. We need to be able to figure out how we engineer solutions to a number of these challenges in terms of design and technologies and buildings and infrastructure. We have to develop an infrastructure system an enforcement system so that people understand what those terms are and that they are met with clear guidance and communication around that. We need to figure out how to develop economic incentives to be able to, supercharge this effort, and then of course we need an effective emergency response team. These have been the 5 E's that have been kicked around for several decades around fire risk prevention. But I'm adding the 6th one, which is empowerment. And that's where the hope piece comes into this conversation, because so many people do not see themselves in this issue or see that there's something that they can do, that they can grasp within their hands that can make a difference. And so however we frame our future solutions and our conversations, I just want to lay it from this context that empowerment has to be at the base core of it, or else people will not take action. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to this panel with some exciting questions that I am interested to hear what people have to say. So, first one, what is the current state of play when it comes to wildfire data and modeling, and how they are used to make strategic evidence-based decisions? Where are there gaps, and how can the state support the development and dissemination of accurate, up-to-date, actionable data for decision makers at all levels? And I bet you could probably kick us off really well with that one.
I can try. Well, thank you for the question. I think to answer this question, one has to reflect on understanding what we're dealing with in terms of trying to drive down risk. I think the previous panel spoke quite a bit about risk and how we can bring down risk. But if we just first try to define risk, I will borrow from the way we define risk for other hazards, and my group works on all type of hazards. So if I look at it in terms of the product of hazard times vulnerability times exposure. So if I look at wildfire specifically, I'd say the hazard is how big the fire is, right? And the vulnerability is the likelihood of damage given the fire size. And the exposure, of course, is the value of the asset. And if we assume all homes are made equal, we know they're not. We know some are more expensive than others. Just ignore that piece for now. We'll just focus on the hazard and the vulnerability. Now, for the hazard and the vulnerability, if I want to translate that into a sort of a mathematical description, I'd ask, what's the probability of fire ignition? What's the probability of the fire propagation given an ignition? And then what's the probability of damage to your building given the propagation? So there's 3 conditional probability that you have to deal with. And if we try to model ignition, it's not difficult to do that. And in fact, there's tons of data on fire ignitions, statistical data. We can actually use that to predict the ignition. The propagation of the fire, in general, generally speaking, there are good models that kind of tells us how the fire propagates in the wildland. If you put the built environment with it and try to model how the built environment alters the propagation of the total fire boundary, there is missing information there. But we can still make good estimates. The missing piece in this equation that I just mentioned is the probability of damage to buildings, right? That's the vulnerability, the missing piece. So we have the ignition, we have the fire size, and then we have the damage. The damage piece from a modeling perspective is what we pretty much don't have. We have been lucky enough to fumble upon developing a model that can predict which building will ignite or survive in a wildfire. That's why I've been invited to this panel. Thanks to the funding from the Moore Foundation and Jenny for giving us that support. But that piece is massively missing. And insurance companies, of course, they don't have that piece of information. That's why they're having a hard time modeling risk or pricing risk. But ultimately, what you try to do is to play with these three different pieces: the ignition probability, the size of the fire giving the ignition, and then the probability of damage giving the size of the fire. And in order for you to play with these three pieces, you have to understand how to predict them. If you manage to play with one or two or three of the pieces, right, that's one way to drive down risk. So driving down risk doesn't necessarily mean we have to harden every single home. If I manage the ignition pretty well, or if I manage the propagation of the fire, I don't have to tinker too much with mitigations for the buildings. Or if I do a lot of hardening and a little bit of fuel reduction, maybe a combination of the two will be enough to drive down risk. So I think it's important to reflect on the fact that we don't have models, very, very few, ours is one of them, to model how the built environment will be impacted. And I think it's a very important piece to understand how the risk can be brought down. The notion, I'll just mention a couple other things. With all due respect, I don't think because there was some discussions, is we know what needs to be done. We actually don't know what needs to be done. In order for you to know, you have to actually be able to model how the fire will propagate in your community and understand which building will ignite or not. And unless you're able to replicate that, right, you're not able to tell which mitigation will impact your likelihood of damage to what extent. So I think that's a very important piece. There is a lot we don't know about modeling. I mentioned one of them. Another one I will mention, if I could spend days talking about modeling and what we know and don't know, but I'll just give you some really interesting thing related to this. There has been tons of discussion on Zone Zero. Zone Zero is one of the maybe 11 things that you can actually use to drive down vulnerability, lower your vulnerability. It's not the only thing, right? There's so many other things. Now, the 0 to 5 feet isn't necessarily, or 5 feet isn't necessarily the magic number. I have a student who's doing some work, and we're finding out that in some cases, depending on the fuel around your home, 7.5 feet is not enough. So do we know everything we need to know about how even the built environment is impacted by having fuel in your backyard and so on? We don't. Yet we actually implement policies thinking that these policies are the solutions. They will help, but the extent to which they will help and how much that help will drive down risk for an individual building and the entire neighborhood is something we don't know yet.
Oh, do I get to say whatever I want? No. All right. Well, I'll keep it quick because I think we're maybe running behind, but I had been asked to just make a note that there is a difference between risk and hazard, and these terms really matter, especially when it comes to legislation. So, for example, whether we like it or not, fire hazard severity zones are what is mapped and what we have, what drives guidance and requirements across the state. So when we see legislation or when we see terms in government code that say high-risk areas, that's very hard to implement because we don't have those defined risk areas. So just wanted to make a note about that because in planning terms, that's really important for us, especially when we get to the general plan. The other point I wanted to make was really the importance of big data. And big data is also, there's a lot of moments right now. I'd say big data is having a moment. And there is a lot of data out there, and some of it's good, and some of it's creating a lot of noise and confusion, and homeowners are getting multiple sources of data, not necessarily knowing what to do with it. One of the types of data that I'm more interested in, I learned this term recently, thick data. I think it had its moment about a decade ago, but it's really about human-centered, contextualized, almost it's sometimes criticized as anecdotal, small, small sample sizes, but it's really where it's the world people live in. It's understanding the world people live in. When we talk about zone zero, there's this proverbial rose bush that we all laugh about, because everyone seems to have a rose bush
Can
in
you
zone.
stop using the rose bush, please?
That's why I'm saying it.
Well,
Everyone has a rose bush.
Let's talk about the ugly juniper. Rose bushes people have emotion to,
Exactly.
but junipers they don't.
So this is exactly it though. Why are we getting stuck on the rose bush? There's something there though. And I'm really interested in saying, okay, if that's what's going to hold people up, why don't we understand that better? And, having done a number of home assessments over the years, I was always excited about the aha moments that people had, when you actually talk to them. So all of this data, some of it's great, some of it's extra noise, but where it meets the local conditions, and I think this is what you were getting at, Jana, is how do we bring mitigation to the local level and talk to people about it and have that communication? And I think that's where the real magic and opportunity is how do we translate information into a humanized way through relationships and understanding? And that's what we see anyway is driving people's decisions on the ground. So only other point I wanted to make is that there are some approaches that are also emerging that are heavily focused on urban environment due to the recent LA fires. What I think we're losing in some of these discussions are mitigations for wildfire that also align with other resiliency objectives. So we really need to make sure that if we're talking about all of these standardized approaches to neighborhoods, for example, and everything that has to be treated and cut in a certain way or hardened in a certain way, we are losing the nuance of how that aligns with other objectives like greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We don't need more low-density communities that are separated by a certain distance if that's the trade-off means we don't have walkable communities anymore. So I really want to make that point that we need to look holistically at these solutions, not just in isolation. Even though I'm a wildfire planner, I really am also an advocate for how wildfire aligns with other objectives for our planet.
So Hassam, you said, what do we know or don't know? The thing I would like to bring up around the kind of moment we're in with data and modeling is why do we want to know? What are we trying to do with this data? I think it's really important to think about the stakes. And if you think about what all the models that the state is putting money into, that the insurance companies are putting money into, everyone's trying to think about how to make investments. People are trying to figure out where can we put money. We know there's not unlimited dollars to be spent, and we want to make those investments wisely. So it's really important to understand the stakes. I think when you start talking, though, about data being basically a driver for prioritization, and then you have to really start talking about governance. And that's the point I want to make from a community perspective, is that I think we really need to make sure that we understand whose data we're using to drive investment decisions, how they were able to contribute that data, what's behind it, who decides how that data is going to be updated. It's such a kind of black box and sort of power grab in a lot of ways to allow this data to happen behind closed doors. We have to bring that into the light. There has to be access to that data. We have to understand how to affect that data, because that's really where the decisions are going to be made. So I think that's really critical. I also think understanding data that's gaps in the data, whose data is being utilized. Most of the information that's utilized right now comes from homeowners. That's not the only people that live in the state. That's driving a lot of our work here. We're thinking about economic value, and there is a lot of economic value in homes, but there's a lot of other data that's important to the wildfire question that isn't just how homeowners are acting or how they're engaging with things. So I think we need to make sure that we're creating access points to the data and modeling questions for communities who have important information to share and who should be part of those governance decisions.
Great. Just a couple quick points. So I think one of the really interesting things that is going on right now is that the data that we have is getting better and better every day. Like the tech tools are expanding at a rapid pace. The inclusion of AI in many of the landscape level models is actually beginning to show like remarkable speed of pace, like increasing pace of the quality of data. So we have actually really pretty good and even better emerging data around things like forest and fire behavior and ecosystem development and benefit, around chaparral habitats, around the built environment itself, right? What we're kind of missing is the data around things like cost trade-offs, avoided costs, the benefits of integrated planning, looking at things like the road network at the same time we're looking at the parks and recreation network, at the same time we're looking at the WUI and the fire resilience benefit of integrating all of those together, right? So we have this really fascinating universe where we have rapid advancement in a lot of the data, and then we have a lot of questions that we can't answer because we don't have enough data in certain areas where there's really significant gaps, right? We don't have really good avoided cost data, although we do have some data that tells us that the cost of wildfire in California is somewhere between $100 and $120 billion a year every year, regardless of what year it is, right? Like it has been, and it's been that for 10 years. We know that like 18 of the 20 most damaging fires have come in the last 20 years, and that this is going to accelerate for the next 70 years, and that we'll have 77% more fire, according to the California Climate Assessment, in 2075 than we have today. So what happened in Palisades and Altadena is going to go on and on, right? So if we don't start linking that data to the avoided costs, that we're going to have really serious problems. But we also don't have really good data around leadership, community development, around what are the social sector improvements that we need in order to get to socializing the answers to these questions, to get that data down to, you called it thick data. I love that. I'm going to go look that up, right? I've always called this data that sings, right? Like it's one thing to look at, essentially a big data model and see what the landscape scale effect is across the entire state. But to the average person, you need to bring it down to the community level. So we don't do a really good job of downscaling our data to the person, which is actually, I think, super important in getting the social change that we need. But I'm actually kind of optimistic about where we are in data. Like we have tools and mechanisms now, things like the task force toolkits that are looking across the state and aggregating data at a regional level that is more relevant, right? Things like the regional forest and fire capacity grant programs that are investing in essentially the social capacity to implement these programs, but then are also developing regional strategies around wildfire mitigation, because we can't really have a one-size-fits-all strategy. And each one of those plans has a data stream moving into it, right? So I actually think we're making a lot of improvement.
Very, very nice. So I think I'm going to start this next question leading off with Molly first. So how do we move from planning to implementation at scale? And where have existing state actions been successful? This is maybe for the rest of the committee too, in supporting community resilience, and where have they fallen short? This is one question, and there's 4 questions in it. So, and then let's add it. What are the enabling conditions that need to be in place, and how do we ensure that they're available to communities across the state? This is a one question, so there's 3 parts to it.
Yes. I think the good news is, am I on? Yes. Yeah. I was only going to focus on the planning piece. Okay. So, as you know, I'm a planner, so the general plan is near and dear to my heart. But we know that has its purpose, long-term vision, blueprint. I think it's safe to say it's not a flexible planning instrument for the day-to-day needs of a community when it comes to wildfire mitigation. So that's why we champion things like the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. We did recently work, also our organization, the Community Wildfire Planning Center, worked with the FACT Network on a toolkit for CAL FIRE. It's on CAL FIRE's website. It's a CWPP toolkit. And I thought it was really exciting because it brought it down the toolkit brought the concepts down to how can communities actually use these tools, right? This isn't just a conceptual plan where you have to go and hire a consultant and spend $200,000 and then come up with a list of things that may or may never get implemented. It was really designed to bring it as a more hands-on collaborative outcome. Another success that we've had is we've also worked closely with CAL FIRE on trainings. I know some of you in the room have been to our trainings, so thank you, and anyone else is invited to come once our next round kicks off. But we bring planners and fire officials and building officials together for a free all-day, one-day training. And at this point, we've trained about 700 people from across the state in 20 different places. And initially, when we started these trainings, I was like, is anyone going to pay attention? How can people sit for 8 hours after COVID and be in a room together and enjoy this, not be on their screens? As it turns out, it's really been magical. Bringing people together in the same room with different perspectives on a topic that requires different disciplines to solve has really been, for me in my career, changing, professionally life-changing, because there's an immediate sense that there is change happening through that process. So again, I think I keep bringing it back to relationships and education and opportunities to share perspectives in the solutions. And then, people are intelligent. They know how then to come up with the solutions once you empower them with the information. So it gets back to that additional E that you shared with us, Yana. So I'll leave it at that because I want to hear from the other panelists too on this.
Michelle, do you want to kick it off next?
Yeah. And I think I want to focus really on thinking about what the enabling conditions to kind of go from planning to implementation really are. That's a lot of the work that my organization has been doing for many years, and I think we need to all kind of take stock of what's happening to the community-based infrastructure in this state and across the country to work on community resilience and wildfire in particular. So I think we have to recognize how much of the funding has come from the federal government to support this kind of work in the past. That is what has built that place-based infrastructure, is a lot of federal dollars going into building grants, supporting organization and community building efforts. There certainly have been many state investments in that as well, but there is a lot of federal investment in that is, going away, or people are concerned about what that's going to look like. And so I think it's important to recognize that the state now has an opportunity to think about how to come in and continue building on those toolkits that have been those people that have been supported and the organizations that exist now. So much of this work, I see people are trying to figure out how to move money or action from the state level to the ground level, and there are existing networks. It is much cheaper to pay for an existing network and keep supporting it than it is to rebuild that. And so I would just really encourage us to think about the kind of place-based infrastructure, the networks of people that are already doing work on the ground, the organizations that already exist, and how we can figure out how to come in and find out how to bridge this gap those organizations are going to be in from a business model that was federally grant supported largely to something else. And we have to come up with what the something else can be. I think the Forest and Fire Management Task Force is working on helping to design a vision and a plan around that. I think I've learned so much being engaged with that task force about the incredible array of state programs that the state agencies really have that all really could be woven together to support a fire resilient and fire adapted communities. And so I think we have a lot to build on, but I just think there's a real need and call to action to say hey, there is a threat to this sort of place-based, community-based infrastructure. I also think that we need to think about how this isn't all about money, and that we need to figure out how to activate regular people. This is partly about workforce and partly about sustaining institutions. It's also about getting residents to take action that they are not getting paid to do on a day-to-day basis. So there are scales of effort and action that need to be enabled, and so we need organizations to enable the larger kind of action. We also need residents to be working with their own families, their own neighborhoods, their community members to take action that they can it is on. Oh, there we go. To take action that they can and and sort of move that forward. So I'll turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Michelle. Taylor, could you throw that slide up for me? Great. This is kind of a really interesting question. So let me just give you an example of a problem that we have and a long-term solution we're going to have to think about. So if you look at the new fire hazard mapping in California, it's 37 million acres, okay? There are 7.1 million homes in that footprint. The average cost of retrofitting one of those homes, based on data from both Headwaters Economics and the preliminary data from the California Wildfire Mitigation Program, is $75,000 a piece. Do the math on that. If you had to do all of those homes, it would cost $500 billion on $9.5 trillion worth of real estate. We're not going to spend that money. Like, we simply are not going to spend that money. So a lot of what we have to focus on is how do we do the most important things in the landscape that is affected at the best cost-benefit ratio in order to reduce the cost of risk reduction and then unlock private and market forces to help make that lift. I'm really encouraged today that a lot of people are talking about integrated infrastructure and planning, because that's one way to get there. But another way to get there is something that we've been using, at least theoretically, within our organization for a while, which is thinking about wildfire resilience across a wildfire resilience transect, right? That there's a certain set of activities that make more sense in wildlands, like, for example, initial vegetation management followed by beneficial fire. And let's talk for a minute about how important beneficial fire really is. Like, California used to have 4 million acres a year of wildfire before European settlement. You know, we were down at one point to 150,000 acres a year, and that's why we're in the problem we're in now, that if we had more low-intensity wildfire that is beneficial to our landscape, the overall cost of treating that landscape would come down, right? So in the wildland area, maybe vegetation management and beneficial fire is the solution. In the rural area, maybe you're looking at a strategy that includes things like land conservation so you can control management, but also fuel breaks and integrated infrastructure. In the wildland-urban interface, maybe this defensible space and home hardening issue and understanding how wildfire moves from the wild vegetation environment into the urban environment and becomes a structure-to-structure fire is a more important focus, right? And in the urban center, the strategy might be looking at public health benefit and evacuation planning and other things in order to avoid, like the Baltimore fire example that Michael used, or the Peshtigo fire, or the other fires that have actually led to widespread human loss, right? But it's not one strategy. It's actually a system that goes from wildland to urban center that uses different strategies in each place, that gets downscaled to the individual region and community, and then the community comes up with the strategy in order to invest the dollars in the best way to unlock other forces in order to achieve that objective, right? And then if we could get to that mindset, then actually, I do think we need to scale up funding, right? I'm not going to say that we don't need more money. We certainly do. But we also need to use our money smarter. We need to use our money in a way that we're actually unlocking other resources and getting the multiple benefits of doing that.
I just want to quickly say, because we created this graphic,
I
love that you added all of these things to the graphic, and you called it a transect, so it's a brain meld.
So exciting. I think what we're doing up here is we're speed dating. So, you know, we're trying to, like, drop some teasers, and then you can figure out which person you want to talk to at the cocktail party. I think that's what we're doing. So we have about 5 minutes left in this session. I'd like to turn it over to the audience to see if you have a burning question. If not, I've got a couple more loaded. We already have front hand going. So we get one question. So question, not comment?
Yeah, I'll make this really fast. Great panel. Michelle, I want to address one thing you said that really resonated with me, and that is data. I've had the opportunity to talk to CAP modelers who actually do fire spread models for insurance companies and ask them, why aren't you using community scale mitigation data? Here's the answer, that they don't believe in it right now. And the biggest issue is capacity. How many fire districts, how many city fire departments, how many county fire departments, CAL FIRE, National Forest do we have? You have to go, if you're a CAP modeler doing a fire spread model for State Farm, you have to go to each one of these and your staff on your nickel or your client's nickel to get it. It's not happening. There's no curation, there's no central data commons. And speaking of Frank Freeval, you guys probably know he's trying to work on that. So that's the number one issue, a public data commons. The other issue is inspection. It's verifying the data. Vegetation grows back. In addition, I'll raise my hand, a lot of us do non-code modifications to our otherwise fire-compliant homes. You have to inspect them every year. The numbers are coming in about $100 a house per year to do that. If the number is $7 million, $700 million worth of inspections a year, where's the money going to come from?
I'm not sure exactly where the money is going to come from, but I can say that I think there's a lot of benefits to pairing local organizations with that work. And I understand that we're trying to do verification. That's like the point of your comment. But I think there's a real opportunity to have trusted voices providing that information and creating that kind of adaptive capacity in that system at a local level that can think about what their vision for living with fire is. Like I love this graphic too, Steve. It reminds me we have this Fire Adapted Communities Pathway tool where it helps them actually develop a strategy that says, what kind of community are we? What relationship do we want with fire? And so I think to me, that is one of the most important things we can do in all of this is invest in place-based work and those people coming up with multiple solutions and funding that.
Anyone else want to grab on this?
Well, and I would add, that might not solve the insurance problem, right? Like you might need to do these two things separately. They might not be as linked as we think they are, right? I mean, I'm going to just say this at the risk of sounding like an anti-capitalist, but like there's a lot of concern in the room about whether or not the insurance industry is getting everything they need in order to essentially answer this question, right? And, you know, maybe we need to decouple the question from actually letting the insurance industry drive our wildfire resilience strategy and actually look at a more regulatory solution around some of the insurance issues than just coaxing them to reduce their rates. So
Maybe this is the point of close because we're close on time. This has been the Fire Adapted Communities Planning for a More Resilient Future panel. And so I'll just wrap up by saying, you know what fire adaptation takes? Adaptation. Right? And so we have to be willing and get into that mindset that we're willing to make change. And that's a key component to this. And I just really want to underscore what Michelle was saying around what does it take to get the work done. And the workforce may look different in different communities, but we clearly need a workforce that's in and throughout California to be able to do that work. And they need to be able to live where they do that work. And so, Michael, just to tug on you a little bit about the electrification issues and the challenges of bringing electricity throughout California, if we don't have people in rural communities, we don't have the capacity to steward those landscapes. And if we don't have schools and we don't have economic development in any way, then we don't have the workforce that's capable of managing that landscape. So it's one of these both and strategies where we have to figure out how to manage the risk and at the same time incentivize good leadership and community development throughout California. So I want to thank you all for a fantastic conversation. Really appreciate being here with you all, and I'll pass it back to Tara and look forward to later on today.
I first want to thank Resources Legacy Fund for support and contribution to make this happen and to bring this together. So thank you. I also just want to note that as we at California Forward are really working to bring together through convenings, through conversation, and ultimately kind of catalyzing action. I really want to thank you all for taking your time to be here with us today. I think we've hit on and just started a conversation around some really important pieces that we are looking forward to continuing to move forward, including how do we actually better align our both economic incentives and economic systems to drive towards better resilience in the context that Mark Eriks just laid out, where we have many challenges, but really looking at where are we finding solutions to deliver an economy that builds resilience, that gets us where we need to go, both for wildfire, but also addressing the challenges that communities are facing on the ground. And I think one of the things that we are very interested in, and this is just a start of the conversation, is bringing a cross-sector of different perspectives to the table who need to be a part of the conversation. Senator Becker had mentioned the importance of bringing kind of insurance folks to the table. We held a convening last week that actually did just that, bringing insurers, rating agencies, some capital providers, to have a conversation touching on many of the things we talked about. This is an important conversation today around where are there policy challenges, but also opportunities, especially when you think about what are the real implementation measures that need to be on the ground to actually drive towards risk reduction and resilience. So I just want to leave with a thank you to you all for taking your time to be here with us today, and looking forward to continued partnership and engagement to find the solutions that we need to be able to go where we all want to go, which is a more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable future and economy. So thank you all so much for being here with us, and hopefully you join us at the reception. So thank you.